Good evening. It's February 1st, and I call the meeting of the Education Committee to order. Here with me are members of the committee, Dr. Davis, Mr. Kessler, and Ms. Iannetti, and a number of other board members and administrators. So welcome, and Dr. Yanni, are there any announcements?
The only announcement that we have today is February 1st, so it's the start to Black History Month. On the 16th, we do have UD Celebrate, which is being sponsored by our African American Black Students and Family Equity Subcommittee of our Equity and Empowerment Steering Committee. That will be held here, or that actually at the middle school. And so stay tuned for more information coming out from the district about that. And we hope that everyone can join us. We've had a 2-year interruption because of the pandemic, so it'll be nice to have everybody back for that celebration.
And I think we need to also add that next Tuesday, February 7th, we have a town hall. Teaching and Learning Town Hall. Is that
We
correct?
do. So that Teaching and Learning Town Hall will be at Sandy Run in the auditorium at 6 p.m. We've put out a call for pre-submitted questions. The evening will start with a presentation by the leadership team. We'll answer any pre-submitted questions, then we'll answer live questions. The event will be live streamed and recorded, so it'll be available on our YouTube channel. And within a week of the event, we'll put out a question and answer document. So those folks who weren't able to come will have a document that they can reference.
Right, thank you. Then let's move on to the minutes. Members of the committee, have you been able to review the minutes? Nods. All right, so is everybody okay to move those on for information on to the legislative? Yes. Yes, thank you. Then we'll move those along. Then it is time for our presentation. Mr. Hoffman and Ms. Puste are going to present on the actionable professional learning experiences.
All right. Good evening. Thank you in advance for the discussion with our presentation tonight. So our focus for this school year, those of you on the board or in the community know that each year our professional learning has a focus area for the year. Those have been anything from They're All Our Kids to how we re-envision learning, reimagine learning. And this year our focus is really around actionable professional learning surrounding the topic of data. So how do we use data to determine our next steps? You can see over the last few months, our professional learning has included IXL, which is a reading, science, math resource that does diagnostics with our students, interventions, remediations, some independent practice for our students. You can see we've had speakers come in, we've reviewed our data review cycle, curriculum work, illustrative math, which we've talked about, is how we kicked off the year. In October, I mentioned a few months ago with you all, we really focus on Act 158. That's the observation and evaluation. Nope, Act 13. Act 158. I was right. Act 158, the observation and evaluation system that includes student performance measures. We recalibrated our benchmark assessment system. So that's the reading assessment that our K-5 students participate in 2 to 3 times a year. You may have heard it referred to as BASS. We like to, every few years, work with our reading specialists and our classroom teachers to calibrate that assessment. So how do we give that assessment? What would you score an assessment? What are errors? What are not errors? So that we can continue to make sure that we, again, not to ever use the word calibrate, but calibrate the scores. January 14th was a half day. Those half days are typically building days, and it was in fact a building half day, but under the district focus area of using data to determine next steps, our buildings worked with their individual staff to work through our district data protocol that they introduced in August and have been using at grade level and department meetings. And they focused on some school-wide data issues. And we'll hear more about that actually at Town Hall next week. So each building will be sharing a little bit about that work. So what is this data protocol? You can see very briefly up there, we have 6 steps to this, where the very first thing is, and we use this protocol with teachers, with administrators. We actually use this with Mrs. Poustey's interview process. So we brought 3 pieces of data with her, with the instructional leadership team and the executive leadership team. And we actually, as a team, went through this protocol. We put her on the spot with 3 pieces of data on our 3rd grade reading that she'd never seen before. But you know, often in interviews, just as an aside, often in interviews, you ask a question about what someone looks like or feels like on a team. And this data protocol allowed us to actually see what Bridget would feel like on a team. And it was a really nice activity. So the protocol is that you have a facilitator, you have a timekeeper, you establish the norms, but you look at the piece of data or pieces of data in front of you. You take some time, you look at those immediate noticings. I noticed that there's a lot of red when we're looking at topic X. I'm noticing that there was a really high performance. So you're thinking, or participation. So you might work through some of those things that you immediately notice. You do that quietly first, and then as a whole group, we share out and talk through that. Then you take more quiet time and then allow processing time to dig deeper into that. What are some noticings and what are some wonderings that you're thinking about? The wonderings are really important. Noticings and wonderings are words that we've been using with Dr. Webb over the past few years for the administration team. As we do our observations, that we don't go in with judgment, but we make noticings and we have wonderings. So when we look at data, we notice things, obviously, but then what might we be wondering? Because that helps us identify what other pieces of data we may need to identify or what other information we may need to seek. We always take time to celebrate, which is really important to do before you get to the hard part, which is where may we have some problems of practice that may need to address those pieces. That's the 5th step of the data protocol. And then the key conclusions and next steps is really those action items that we take. So what are we doing next with the information that we have? From our wonderings, we may need to go and pull a report and link it to see how this data compared to the last assessment that a student was given. We may need to get another group of people together to put some context behind some of the information that we're looking at. So those key conclusions and next steps have been really powerful. This is something that our departments and grade levels work through with their curriculum leaders and principals to work through common assessments, their local assessments, benchmark assessments, et cetera. So the next part of our presentation and discussion tonight, we're going to look at an example of how this view of data that we've been working through, if you remember the first slide about professional learning, is looking actionable at 3 levels. Actionable in our elementary schools, at our middle school, and our high school. What's really important to know is that oftentimes we present, and it's a topic that, an example that we have from a teacher, a specific teacher's doing something in their class. Our elementary example is common across all elementary schools and all grade levels. Our middle school example is common across all middle school English classes, and our high school example is across all high school English classes in 9th and 10th grade. So we're really proud of the fact that our teachers are continuing to apply their learning. So I'm not going to read all of these slides, but when these are put on the website, I do like to have as much information there. But under Mr. Mishner's, our supervisor of STEM, and Matt Dornman and Julie Rank, our instructional support specialists for STEM, they've been working with our teachers this year to establish common assessments across grade levels across the district for elementary math. Those assessments have been collaborative with our teachers. Our assessments existed pre-COVID. They were very long assessments. Those of you who had kids in elementary schools may remember those long Eureka assessments that would come home. These are versions where we're pulling back, we're prioritizing what questions we are asking, how we're asking them, because the way that students are assessed on our state assessments often look a little different than they would in previous years. So we're looking at how we assess. We're also adding spiraled questions, so content from previous assessments that need to continue to come back to make sure that we are either maintaining or sustaining or growing in some of those areas. There's a focus on application on these common assessments. And probably the greatest piece that I want to show you is this slide, which is in Linkit. So this is a data locker that our teachers are using now. And so teachers will put students' math assessment scores into data locker. And last time you heard me talk about data locker, it was for the benchmark assessment, where we record where student levels are so that we can see across the district trends. This is by standard, PA standard, number of questions, and if they're beginning, approaching, or meeting that standard. And so we're able to, on every common assessment, get a snapshot of where classrooms are by skill, by content area. Bridget, it was standard, skill, topic, and depth of knowledge. So standard, topic, skill, and depth of knowledge on each question that we offer to our students. So we can look at a snapshot of a classroom, we can look at a small group of students, we can look across the third grade in our district and see where those trends are. Mr. Mishner gets really excited talking about the fact that the more that we do this, the more reliable our data will become over the years. We'll be able to triangulate and use these assessments to connect to how are our students who score in the approaching range do when they take an assessment, such as the PSSA, how are they doing on an easy CBM assessment compared to local assessments. So we talk a lot about triangulating data. One of the things that Dr. Yanni and I spoke about today was that data like this in our data management system helps us have a continuing story of student learning, that we're not just presenting an end of year reactive in many cases PSSA Keystone conversation, but that we're really telling our story as we move along.
We think that's really important because, as we know, there's been disruption to the PSSAs and to the Keystones. And once parents and families opt their students out of those assessments, the likelihood of them not opting their students out in the future is slim, right? And so this past year, when we looked at our PSSAs in some grade levels, for example, 7th grade math, only 72% of the students took the assessment. So trying to drive data conversations around scores that are representative of only 72% of a grade level, those conversations aren't fruitful. Prior to the pandemic, we were hitting 95, 96, 97% of our kids taking those assessments. Upper Dublin is not alone in that big hit to participation rates. So it really is important that we're able to articulate on a daily basis how our kids are doing, in addition to how they do on those state assessments.
So I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse into middle school and high school and some of the examples that we have there. So as part of our vision for 2025, at the middle school, we're really focusing on our text-dependent analysis, or our TDAs. Specifically, our ELA teachers in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade are really focusing this year and working through the TDA process with our students and the process with one another. So at the beginning of this year, our ELA teachers gave all of our students what we call a cold TDA. So they had never seen it before. They were not, prepped for that TDA. And what our teachers did is they took that cold TDA and together collaboratively worked together to see what are the skills that our students really need. What is it that we can do to scaffold our instruction in our classrooms to meet the needs of our learners and to really make sure the instruction that we are giving is the best that we can possibly do. So they took that cold TDA right in the beginning of the year, and they're getting ready to do a second TDA this February to really see if that scaffolded instruction that they put together is really making the difference in having our students grow in that area. One of the other things additionally that they're doing is working together to do something called inter-rater reliability. So it's looking at a piece of writing anonymously, having all of your teachers score it using the rubrics that we have, and to see if we are scoring in the same way, using our standards and using the rubrics that we have to really make the best decisions that we can, but also to grade it in the most appropriate way possible. So they're doing that. They're working together. That is a work in progress for our teachers. We're still working through that. But one of the things that we found is that Linkit has some availability and some different features where we can do some blind scoring. So we're investigating to whether we would like to use Linkit if it is a tool for that our teachers and of course to all of our students. In addition to that, we are also, we're trying to look at our TDAs and possibly doing one more TDA prior to PSSA so that we can look at the data that we're getting from our TDA. Is the instruction that we're scaffolding making a difference with our TDA in February? Doing possibly another one in March to see if we're hitting the right skills and the right strategies with our students, that we're seeing that growth over 3 times this school year. So our teachers are really working hard this year to collaborate with one another, to compare the results that they're getting from our TDAs, and to really make informed decisions about the instruction that they're doing within their classrooms. Go ahead.
So when we talk about TDAs in the context of state assessments, I want to be clear about a couple of things. So the demand of writing on state assessments has changed drastically over the last couple of years. As a former elementary teacher, the writing up through 5th grade was very basic. Kids would read a passage and they would have to write a response on a very low-level basic question. And if you had a topic sentence, 3 details, and a conclusion sentence, kids were able to pass that portion of the PSSA. And even in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, the writing demand was not very high. The process of the TDA is to really move beyond literal comprehension and get into interpretive and evaluative comprehension. So there's a lot of analysis work going on. And so when you hear us talk about TDAs in terms of PSSAs and keystones, we're not prepping for state assessments. This is good quality writing. It's a type of writing that is typically done in English classes. The biggest thing, I know Ms. Pousset just spoke about the middle school. Last year we noticed when we were able to see the released items for 3rd grade, even though 3rd graders were not asked to write a TDA, there were TDA type questions on the PSSA that really required kids to understand multiple passages at very deep levels and understand the interconnectedness between and among them. So this is really deep thinking. And so when you hear, sometimes people say, well, we only wrote 3 in a year. Writing one of these TDAs is a really big deal. And I echo what Ms. Pousset said about how well our teachers are working, because they're really moving kids to those interpretive and evaluative levels of comprehension.
So just to piggyback off of how we're supporting that TDA process, what you see on the screen or in this presentation is a common framework that was developed K to 8. So these are individual slides made for each grade level that provide resources and toolkits that help our teachers find some of these resources to help prepare our students for TDAs, not just like Dr. Yanni said, for a test, but for writing in general. So the snippet that you see on the screen is focused on 7th and 8th grade. However, our K through 8 teachers all have access to this, so they can see, you know, the progression from K to 8 in writing a well-written TDA. So when you see in the top left corner, you see that there's the progression chart. You can see some of the K to 5 writing standards. So clicking on those links, our teachers can see what are some of those progressions from the grade level before them, what were they expected to do the year before, and where are they going this year and then into the year beyond them. You can also see under 8th grade, just as an example, there's a fantastic resource called the TDA Toolkit. It is fantastic for our teachers, great resources and information that they can use to really help their instruction within their classroom. And then, of course, at the bottom, it gives some information about what students will be able to do. This is just an example of informational text. So if I'm writing a TDA for informational text, these are some of the things that I expect our students to be able to do in this particular grade level. But there is a slide in this common framework and toolkit for each of our grade levels. So no matter if you're K to 8, all of our teachers have access to that so they can see where they came from and, of course, where they're going, which is a great thing. One of the things that I do want to stress with TDAs and with this is really that it's really the merging of reading and writing standards. It's really not just about writing that piece, but it's really truly understanding what we're reading and that merging of those reading and writing skills in order to write a really effective piece. So moving on to our high school example, as Mr. Hoffman had stated, our 9th and 10th grade teachers, our ELA teachers, gave for the first time the Linkit Keystone benchmark. And so what they are going to be doing is really delving into that data on our February 10th PLE day. And we are fortunate enough that our consultant from Lincoln will be joining us on the 10th. And she's really going to be taking our teachers through and delving into how do we look at all the information that is there. And Mr. Hoffman and I today, we just even delved more into it. And as we kept going, you kept seeing more and more things that you can get into with Linkit and with specific student information. So as I share with you a couple graphs tonight, I don't want you to get into the numbers because Linkit has people that, you know, really get into the numbers and what those bandwidths are. So sometimes when we're looking at 86% are proficient, it may look different depending on the standard that we're really getting into. So, you know, don't get hung up on the numbers, but when we look at the graph that you see, which is a quick snapshot, you know, that green is our proficient, about 5% is the bubble students, and then, you know, basic and below. But we can see that our students are doing very well on this benchmark, but the information that we can get from Linkit that really drills down into specific standards is the most important information that we can have. So on the next slide, when you look at these charts, that very first column is the overall. So we can see the number of students that were proficient on this benchmark. We can see the number of students that were on the bubble, and then what you can't see is the individual student names. So these represent individual students and what they scored on the Linkit benchmark. To the right, all those different pie charts, the 4 on the right, all represent a different standard. And so when we look at it, we can see how an individual student did on this particular standard, but we can also see which standards we really need to focus on if we are the teacher of that class and of that course. So in looking at this data, we can see that reading for meaning in nonfiction and fiction looks pretty strong. We definitely have students that maybe we need to focus a little bit more on in this area, but for the most part, it's showing us some strong data. Ones that we need to maybe work on in this particular class or in this particular setting would probably be the analyzing and interpreting literature, whether that's fiction or nonfiction. when our consultant comes from Linkit, she's going to drill down even further. She's going to show them specifically questions that they had right or wrong, and specifically how we can group students based upon the standards that we see, and how this information can really drive our instruction in the classroom and really make it tailored to the students who are sitting in front of us. So I think this is a great example of what Linkit can do, but how it really can inform the instruction that we're doing within our classrooms.
Just before we move on to the next slide, one of the powerful things I think really about that I can say with this high school example, this came from the high school teachers saying, we heard Linkit has benchmarks and we'd like to try those. We'd like to see what kind of information that gives us. We have some social studies teachers, 2 social studies teachers that have been putting their assessments, their midterm assessments in here. And they're able to tag topics and be able to look at how are students doing on certain topics, what kinds of students are struggling on what kinds of topics, or reaching success in others. So I do just think, when you look at this, it allows us, you often hear districts talk about a profile of a graduate or something to that effect, but I think it helps us really understand how is the instruction, our tier 1 instruction, that instruction that all students receive in the classroom, how is it meeting the needs of our students? What students are realizing success? How do we eliminate some of those barriers? We talk about access, opportunity, choice. I think this is really valuable to see this information, and our teachers are really excited about it. As Dr. Yanni was saying about the complexity of some of the tests, and that, that TDA skill being seen in a reading assessment early on, Linkit allows us to look at depths of knowledge of questions. How do students do on certain types of depths of knowledge? How do they do on specific standards and skills? So it allows us to look at assessments in ways that typically you go, all right, they got an 80 on the benchmark. Let's keep going. Let's try to get 85. But this is such a way that it really provides targeted focus.
So just to wrap up a little bit, our next steps are professional development. We have 2 professional learning experiences coming up, one on February 10th and one on March 10th. And really, we have to thank our curriculum leaders, our IPD leaders, our administrators, and all of our teachers, because through their feedback, they have helped us to design what those professional learning experience days will look like for the 10th and for February 10th and for March 10th. So we took their feedback and their information about what they specifically need and what they specifically want to focus on, such as, the Linkit benchmarks, looking more into the TDA, and really developing those 2 days around the needs at all of our 3 different levels. Our weekly collaboration meeting times in our buildings are another way in which we are continuing that professional development, continuing that conversation, not only about the data, but about the instruction that's going on within our classrooms. And then, as Dr. Yanni mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we will be having a teaching and learning town hall next Tuesday from 6 to 8 at our middle school, really focusing on data for K-12 and presenting on that. An overview of our Linkit portal for all of our parents and families, and then having the opportunity to submit questions for our Q&A at the end of that presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Questions from the committee? Dr. Davis?
Yes, I had just a couple right off the top of my head. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the inter-rater reliability. I think that's, I think it's so important. I remember when PSSAs first came out, and I remember going off to Harrisburg or somewhere to, make sure that we were, able to score, the same across the board. But it was a really difficult process. And so I just want to hear a little bit more about how the teachers are kind of managing, and how much time have you been able to allot to really get to that point where we're consistent across the board?
So it is definitely a work in progress with the inter-rater reliability. We did spend some time looking at that very first TDA and the rubric, and spending some time comparing how we scored, how one teacher scored this piece versus another teacher. It is something that we definitely want to spend more time in and looking at blind scoring, not knowing who the student is that's handing in that piece and really using that rubric to drive how we're grading and how we're scoring that piece. One of the things that we do want to focus on this summer is building that 6 through 8 writing framework, and that rubric piece is a really important and vital piece of that framework. But it is a process, so we're trying to use our collaboration time in order to do more of that inter-rater reliability. We're trying to use our professional learning time to do some of that too. So on February 10th, they'll have a little bit more time to talk through some of that and look through those TDAs, but it is a work in progress moving forward. But I do agree with you, it is so important because we want to use that rubric to make sure that, we're looking at those components that are important in that piece and not who's turning in that piece of writing.
Okay, great. And it'll be interesting and important for you to bring back and keep us informed on how that process is moving along.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Another question I had, when you're talking about the revised common math assessments, so I'm going to shoot over to Mr. Hoffman. Can you talk about kind of the timeline on when you feel that we'll be able to complete, that process for all the Upper Dublin courses that we offer?
So it's a hefty lift when you think of every single assessment, K-5 for math. And again, kudos to our instructional sports specialists for really taking on that work. They have been giving common assessments up to this point in the district. The data locker is going to be the new piece, but I would say by the end of the year that we should have all of our assessments aligned and aligned and refined to this expectation. So our goal is by the end of the year, but as you know, in any assessment, once you give assessments, you need really to take time to dig in and look and allow that cycle to take place. But the assessments are ongoing and they're staying ahead of them as they go. The good news is, as we said, these assessments for the most part existed. They're given at the midpoint and the end of units. They've actually peeled back the length of time that those are taking, so they've adjusted that and they've added those spiraling pieces. So it's really been refining the assessments and making sure that we're assessing students the way that they need to be able to apply those concepts.
All right, any other questions? Dr. Levinovitz?
The middle school example slide, the first bullet you talk about, middle school teachers are working on TDA analysis. The last bullet, time will be offered in March to complete an additional TDA. I'm confused what a TDA is. Does it depend on the grade level? Is it just a document? What does it mean what a TDA is?
It's like an essay. It's a written response. So a TDA is a text-dependent analysis. So in order for the analysis, the writing to occur, they're using a text.
So they're reading a paragraph,
They're reading
or maybe
something.
depending on the grade level, more.
And so when we've been working on TDA over the past few years, at least since I've been here, I know it's been a pretty big emphasis in our elementary schools. And it's been I think a point of pride in our PSSA across the state. A lot of districts' scores started to dip pretty low when the TDA was introduced a few years ago, and Upper Dublin has really been leading the way. When we were trained my first year at Patan, they said, oh, Upper Dublin, what are you doing? So we've had some good work here. I think the introduction of the K-5 writing framework and focusing this to our Vision 2025, which is that writing expectation, it's allowed us to really make sure that we're vertically aligning that instruction. I remember one of our trainings earlier in the year, a kindergarten teacher said, well, when I'm reading a book, and say, how do you think the character's feeling? And they say happy, and you say, how do you know that? Well, he said, like, that's text-dependent analysis. They're referring back to the text to explain what they're thinking. And so that skill, as we really firm up over the K-8 experience, then you take that into high school, and that's relevant when you're in a social studies class doing a DBQ, which is a document-based question and answer. It's a synthesis essay on an AP Lit or an AP Lang exam. So it's that concept. It's an analytical writing that is reliant upon reading some sort of text.
At this point, are we creating the TDAs, or are they standard?
Yes, and we have our own district-created ones. We use released from the state. And, you know, Mr. Dorneman, one of our instructional support specialists, after his training my first year, was creating them with fifth grade and for his fifth grade team and working through that. So yes, using some of our own and using some of others.
Okay, then my other question on the high school example, the Linkit Keystone benchmarks, what is that? How long does it take to administer?
Can we go, I'm sorry, Dr. LeBeau, can we go back to the TDA question for just a second?
Thank you.
So with the TDA, one of the things that we've noticed over the last couple of years is that students may need to write a text-dependent analysis, TDA, based upon multiple pieces of text. So they might read a piece of fiction, a poem, and a snippet of something nonfiction. And the question might be, how did the author in each piece use tone or use mood or use foreshadowing to prove their point? So not only do you have to know what the literary concepts are, you have to be able to write about those literary concepts. Those are scored on a 12-point scale. And so when kids complete those for the PSSA, you either get a 12, an 8, a 4, or a 0. Most of our kids are scoring either 8s or 12s. So as Mr. Hoffman said, it's a real point of pride for us. Now, we also know what PDE does. They up the ante every couple of years, right? So this is really good writing. So the reason that Mr. Hoffman, I think, gave you the kindergarten example is it needs to start with thinking, because writing is thinking. So if we can start kids thinking at the kindergarten level about things at deep levels, and then we translate it into basic writing and more sophisticated writing, what we do then over the course of a kid's K-12 experience is we make sure they leave us very competent writers, not just readers, but writers as well.
Thank you for that.
And then in terms of the Keystone benchmarks, these are just aligned assessments that test creators use release tests and or test generator created through Linkit. They take place within a period at the high school. They can be paper pencil or completed on the Linkit testing system. And the reason we gave it with 9th and 10th is they really are indicators of the state standards to see where they are. 10th is really more of a, we're getting close to that testing period, and 9th is really letting us see where we are on that journey prior to teaching some of those 10th grade standards.
I think what's so critical when you do the Keystone benchmarks is to explain to the students, you know, this is not a test that you're going to be scored on. This is a test that will benefit you for the whole year, and that you really need to do your best, but it's okay if you don't know something.
Yep.
But really work hard at that assessment. I always wonder how seriously some of our students take the PSSAs and Keystones. So this should really be emphasized that this is a different kind of a analysis.
I think that it is, and I didn't hear overwhelmingly from any teacher that our students didn't take this because I think didn't take it seriously because I think the context was there. One of the pieces that the teachers have specifically asked with our educational consultant next week is how can they make more of this information student-friendly in order to be able to get them back to set some independent goals and to really process their place. So I'm excited that our teachers are also thinking through that perspective, not just from an instructional perspective, but from the student lens.
How many subject areas do these benchmarks?
They have them,
Assess.
I believe, second or third grade through 12th.
And subject
all subject areas.
Well, like biology.
Yep.
chem-
And our biology actually is
Wow.
talking about looking at testing some of these. We had a third grade team in a building a few weeks ago that just tried. We didn't know until we went in there. They were excited when they saw the third grade benchmarks and wanted to see where their kids were. And it's really exciting to see. As I said, our teachers are excited about this kind of information and really using it. So yes, they're all grade levels, content areas.
All right, other questions? Ms. Evans?
So obviously, the biggest benefit, right, of Linkit and these common assessments is to identify areas where students may need support, right? But I imagine this would also enhance our ability to identify teachers that may need support if we're seeing kind of a trend, you know, all the students who came from this class, particularly when you talk about the spiral review, right? When we're now reassessing them on something from last year, all the students who had Teacher Evans, right, didn't seem to grasp this concept, so can we give Teacher Evans some additional, you know, support in that area? Is that, I assume that's something that we could kind of get from this tool as well, right?
I think anything's certainly a piece of data. I would twist just a little bit of an example. We're actually going to talk through this one at Town Hall, but sometimes when we look at data, we realize that we taught the skill appropriately, but we didn't teach students to do what they needed to do with that information the right way. And so one of our grade levels recognized in really digging in to some of our state reported data last year said, well, wait a minute, I have information that shows my students knew this. And when we compared the way that they were assessed in an application level, not at a what's the answer level. And the teacher said, I got this. I know what I need to do now with some of the assessments. I have an activity I can do. And so I think in any of those ways, it's a good informational piece, both for a teacher to look at, for administration to look at. Certainly, Dr. Yanni.
As we think about core instruction, so you hear us sometimes talk about tier 1 instruction, and you'll hear me say that we can't intervene our way out of a tier 1 problem. And so when we give a benchmark and we look at the results, if we see that there are a significant number of students that didn't perform well on the grade level, in the department, or in a teacher's classroom, it allows us to respond to say, how can we make that tier 1 instruction better? Because if we're not good at that tier 1 instruction and we're giving kids interventions, we're intervening on something that's shaky. And that intervention is not going to be as fruitful as it would be if the core is strong. We're also looking at our students with IEPs and GIEPs. So are our students that are receiving replacement instruction in an area, how are they performing? Are they ready to move back into core curriculum with support? Or what are their needs? When we look at our students with GIEPs, are they making growth or are they stagnating? And so it allows us to be more intentional when we look at the data to develop instructional plans around what to do for sort of each group of students. Last year was the first year that we really saw in Upper Dublin that our students with GIEPs exceeded the growth standard, and we want to keep that up. We always see that our students with IEPs are meeting the growth standard, but we never want to get complacent and say, well, a student has an IEP, they're not going to do well on the benchmark. If you think back to the strengths-based perspective that we talked about a couple months ago, even if a student struggles on a benchmark, there are still strengths there that we can use to extrapolate, to build upon, so that we can help students become better consumers of information and be able to use that information in ways to satisfy the necessary learning from the standard.
All right, thank you. One of the things that I think is pretty evident from this presentation is that we now really have a framework where we actually are looking at progress and measuring it. I think it's it's taken a couple years to really get that together. I think Dr. Webb's influence is visible here, but also really the leadership team and all the curriculum leaders really passing this on so that teachers are equipped with this information. Because I think it's so easy to just look at grades, but to actually break it down in these specific standards, I think is really very informative, not just for the district, but also for individual teachers. My question is, how do students and families become aware of this, or to what extent do they become aware of this? I mean, you mentioned that this is part of the presentation next week. Can you give us a little bit of a preview of that? Or a promo?
Sure. Currently, I would say from a parent perspective, seeing some of this information, it really depends on what the assessment is. With a BAS assessment, for example, they'll get that information not as a letter, B or a D or an F, but really in terms of indicators, reading behaviors and such that they talk through during conferences or that they'll see on a progress report. So some of this information feeds how a progress report or a report card would look. Some of it feeds the types of activities that students are doing in their classes. So Dr. Levinowitz was saying, just as it almost sets a goal for individual students. So some of it feeds there. We have the potential to add any of these benchmarks or any of these other assessment pieces to the parent-student portal that we'll talk more about next week. One of the reasons why we don't just say, let's open it all up, is we really want to make sure that we understand, what the information is as educators before we open up, assessments that may look funny. Sometimes we'll see whenever one of our easy CBMs go in, as an example, sometimes the percentages are off, and so it makes everything red for a whole class, and it's not red for a whole class. And if that went into a parent portal, immediately we'd have 100% of parents panicking in a given class. And so we really just want to see how we can work with this and communicate the data before we open up those possibilities. But it's all there, and I think it gives us a way that once we feel more confident with what it says and how we use it, that story becomes part of that.
Yeah, because it can be quite overwhelming, I think, for people to see all this data and what do you do with it and how much to read into it, because single data points might not really say a whole lot. And I don't want people to sort of panic over every single piece of information.
I mean, one piece with benchmarks in any given year, a keystone benchmark that you give in the fall is an assessment of those keystone standards for the year. And so there are likely standards that haven't been instructed yet, and so teachers know, I'm going to get to that in December. I'm not worried about the yellow right now. Parents might go, what do you mean my kid has a yellow score right now? And so that's where we just really, I think it comes back to the purpose of the assessment so that we know what or why we would communicate that.
Yeah, the context is going to be important, and communicating that in an effective way is going to be yet another project, right? I think, one last question I had was, are all these assessments done online, or are they paper and pencil, or is it a mix?
It's a combination. It can be anything. Even the paper pencil, though, you can scan those through the copiers and it scores within the system and uploads. So it creates like a bubble sheet for the students. So I think it's a balance, and teachers are kind of going with where they are right now. Dr. Yanni and I met with Mrs. Ward a few weeks ago and know that, certain college board assessments, APs and SATs and others are going to be introducing computer options, and in some cases requiring computer for the administration. And so, that's something that we just need to kind of keep a pulse on, that we want to meet students where they are. How they take the test shouldn't be the barrier to us knowing what they know, but we also have to, get them used to taking the assessments in a variety of ways.
All right, thank you. I see one more question. Ms. Hawthorne.
I can appreciate using data to make decisions. I'm curious around what's the range. So how much data do we have? Is it just 2022, 2023? And then how are we looking to compile the data over time to make some decisions for the district?
So the good news is we have multiple years of data. We have standardized assessment data going back as long as we've been giving, or the PSSAs have been given. In 2015, the standards changed and the assessments changed, so 2015 is kind of our cut. In terms of common assessments, over the years as curriculum was developed, both under Ms. Morrison, the previous director of curriculum, and under our curriculum supervisors now, those common assessments have been embedded in the curriculum, so we have all of that data. So when we talk about data to judge effectiveness, we're also looking at the effectiveness of not just how we're teaching, but what we're teaching, right? And about 2 years ago, the state made some revisions to the standards because as the state went from the Pennsylvania academic standards to the Pennsylvania core standards, they lumped, in many cases, 4, 5, 6 standards together to create one core standard. And so we look at the standard and then we look at the eligible content, how things can be asked, what kids need to do with that standard. So we have that, we have all of that data so that we can look historically. Where have students struggled? How have we worked around barriers? What Mr. Hoffman is talking about now, making sure that as we make this transition to Linkit, it's just going to be so much easier to use that data, right, than it was before. And one of the things that I really like about our district is teachers have a fair amount of say in how we do things through our IPD process. We actually have teachers that are craving this. So many times when an initiative gets rolled out, I hate to even call it an initiative, but when an initiative gets rolled out, you get people with their backs up. People want to continue to explore Linkit because they see a way to find not only efficiencies to save them and students' time, but a better way that they can get the data and act on that data right away. And it's also going to allow us, for students who go to Eastern, for students that are out of district, to be able to share data more fluently back and forth. When kids come to us from other districts, if they come from a district where their data is in Linkit, we're going to be able to see their data much faster. We're not going to have to do so much, digging into records to find the data.
All right, thank you. And thank you for all the hard work on this, because this is a presentation that sort of covers a lot of work by many people, so appreciate that. So let's move on to item 6 on the agenda. There are 3 items. One is an educational agreement, one is a conference, and then there are student activities. Are there any questions or comments by members of the committee or the board? No, I think so. Then are we okay to move that on for the legislative agenda? Yes. All right, let's do that. And that brings us to public participation. If you want to participate, please state your name and where you reside in the township, and please come up to the microphone.
Thanks for your time today. My name's Steve McEwen. I live, where else did you want me to say? Where I live, or?
Where in the township you live, yeah.
I live on Shepherd Drive in the township. So thank you for your time. What I'd like to talk to the group about tonight is safety. So as a concerned parent, I have 2 high schoolers, freshman and a senior at the school. And the lockdown that happened last week, I felt that the communication was lacking, okay? I was in the office, my wife was at home, I'm getting texts from my kids. One child was here, happened to be at school, and I felt that the communication, just what did come out, lacked substance, right? And, so I went to your website, and it says about communicating with the district, district email, Infinite Campus, automated calls and texts. I didn't get that, right? I heard there was a Facebook Live. I'm not a Facebook user, or I'm not on it all the time, right? Twitter's on here. But the other part of this is, what is the plan? Like, your plan that you have in place was breached, right? And then what happens is parents are getting together and speculating. We're searching, like, we're not getting information from you, so we're going to go find information. There are kids. Like you say to me, your kids are my kids. Well, you know what? If you were my kid's dad, I would say you didn't do your job. So I'm like the communication was lacking. The concern is like, oh my gosh, right? That what's going on, everybody knows, right? The society we live in. These kids came in our school, breached your perimeter, however they did it, right? And then we saw, there was pictures about them getting food at Wawa, right? Now, no, that's not you, that's the police district, but just the whole optics of it from a parent's perspective, like, wow. So I'm just stepping up tonight and would like to understand what happened, if there could be some more information shared, and what's the school doing to prevent something like that. So thank you for your time.
Jenny Vitella Ambler. I just want to piggyback on what Steve said in that he's not alone. Okay, so I felt like on Friday, other days afterwards, there was a lot of concern. I wasn't, because my son didn't even respond to me, and my daughter said, I'm fine, and everything's fine. And they kind of laughed about it, but I know that he is definitely not alone. I actually was kind of alone in that I wasn't as nervous as others, so it definitely was an issue, and people are very afraid, exactly what Steve says, especially in this day and age, especially when the term lockdown came out. That was, the term, and of course, the videos and everything else that was coming from inside the school, we just didn't know. And then, of course, there's rumors that these students are back in, or whatever happens, that we're not sure. Like, someone gets disciplined for something maybe milder, it seems, or at least the optics. And so that's why when there's a lack of communication, all different information is put out there. And I know there's a limit on what you can say, but if there's an optic, and I know it can't be totally avoidable, but some people feel like, oh, I'm getting disciplined for this infraction, which pales in comparison to this kid did this, and this kid this, and oh my gosh, they're back in school after 2 days, and more disruptive to the kids that care and want to be here and want to be good kids and not in trouble. And then from an education standpoint, I'm always been baffled or curious how we really can, if we have a classroom full of students that really range in capabilities, and we get that graphic where we have the green, the yellow, the red, or whatever, how realistic is it to expect a teacher of a classroom of 25 to 28 children that range in capabilities to make it interesting enough for the kids that excel and not leave the ones that are struggling dumbfounded and shutting down? It seems like a really tough task to ask, and I just don't know how it's possible. And can you give me maybe an example of how someone at a high school level, I mean, elementary, I don't know how big that range is, and they maybe have more supports, but if someone's in regular, not honors or AP English, let's say, how is a teacher really changing what they're learning? Or how is someone challenging someone who's doing well while also helping someone who's not? It seems like a big task. Thanks.
Can you use the microphone, please?
Sure.
Thank
Is
you.
that, my name is Sharon McEwen, and I have 2 girls in high school. And I'm here tonight also on the issue about the safety. And reiterating what was said before, please use more communication than just an email. We get communication for snow days through text messages, phone calls, much appreciated. Can't we utilize that? If not, why not? What were the lessons learned coming out of this? I mean, in this day and age, we're kidding ourselves. We hear so many stories if we don't think that this can happen again. So tying into that, what is the education part with the staff? How are the staff notified for lockdowns? What if they're away from their desks? I heard from various sources that doors were open, kids were taking tests. Maybe that is after all things were cleared. I don't know. I worked in academic settings where there's teachings all the time for violence in workplace, intruder, whatnot. I worked in corporate settings where you're trained not to have or allow someone to tailgate come through the doors. I know that police are a valuable asset in our community, much, much appreciated, but how well are they trained and know the layout of the school, the lay of the land, when they're on the outside, they're not inside? Is there an option, can't we visit an option to have security in our high school? We are located obviously off of 309. We all know that there was a car waiting outside. We also see all the incidences in our country that things have gone on and lessons learned. Once the intruder's in the school, they're in. And luckily they were spotted by whomever. But if they went one direction versus another, it could have been a totally different outcome. So those are my concerns. And also revisiting the discipline part of kids that might do minor things and versus something that's truly a repeat offense or a repeat offender, so to speak, slang term, whatnot. But I think that needs to be revisited. I mean, there's a lot of concern this past week coming out of that. I cannot tell you that a lot of parents I spoke to that they were really concerned about how this was handled, how we're moving forward. I know there used to be drills that were done at Maple Glen for intruders or lockdowns or evacuation. I'm not hearing that really, that it's done here. So maybe this does tie in with the education piece. So I just think we really need to look at the fact we're not living in an ivory tower, and we really need to take a look at the options of security in the building. The worst nightmare is getting, a phone call and responding to the scene that your kids aren't coming out at the end of the day. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm not seeing other people coming up to the microphone, and we have not received any written input, so I'd like to close the participation. And Dr. Yanni, do you want to take this?
Sure. So I'll start with the safety question. So I think the district has to own the fact that a text message didn't go out or a phone call. I've talked with the administrative team about that information should go out, or information should go out that way, because not everyone is checking their email. There was an Infinite Campus message that went out, but you're absolutely right, and that won't happen again. So when there is any type of incident that would require a lockdown, so everyone has to stay in place in the building, or a lockout, we're not going to let people into the building because maybe something's happening in the area, information will go out at least via email, text, and phone call. So I addressed that with Mr. Schultz and the high school team, and then the larger administrative team. The reason there was a video posted on Facebook, that was not intended to be the sole means of communication, but we knew that there were other things being live streamed. So students in the room with the police, there was a student live streaming the event. District personnel were not in that room. They were in the room with the police. So we wanted to assure parents that, and not just parents, but guardians and caregivers and families, that the situation was under control. The point about security, we've added a fourth security guard to the high school. So now we have better coverage during the day. Mr. Schultz, we had a meeting with the Upper Dublin Police yesterday. We have quarterly meetings with the township and with the police, and we went over all of our protocols. The high school has staffed the doors, the 4 main entrances where kids come in the morning with more people. It's a reminder that even if you're not on duty, you are on duty, because we have to be able to recognize when students aren't ours. And the only way you do that is by being out in the hallways and constantly getting to know kids, right? We're very thankful to the staff member who saw the students come in. She directed them with the student who was the Upper Dublin student that came with them into her room. And within about 30 seconds, administration was there, security was there, and the police had been called. The police are really valuable partners with us. Each day, the police walk through each of our buildings at least once. The police department does drills in each of our buildings, so they are very familiar with the layout. In fact, we give the police not only our building layouts, our floor plans, anytime anything changes, but they also have card access into our buildings. So if they need to get into a building, they have access to do that. We do quarterly drills, so the Department of Education requires us to do at least a fire drill once a month. We also do severe weather, we do lockdown, we do lockout. In the spring, we'll do an offsite evacuation and reunification. We invite the Upper Dublin Police to all of those drills. Officer Madrak, it's Corporal Madrak now, is usually the member of the police force that is with us, and they come to those drills to give our principals and our staff constructive feedback. What worked, what didn't work, what needs to be changed. Our administrative team and the police also do random checks of outside doors during the school day to make sure that doors are not propped open. I've had to write some discipline this year because when we started the year, I said to principals, if I become aware of a prop door, that's a failure of leadership, because the directive is no prop doors. And so multiple people have received notices of discipline this year because of imprudent decisions. In addition to all of that, when we do our normal drills, all of our administrators each summer, anyone who is new gets NIMS certified, which is National Information Management System, and it walks you through how to handle situations from the time to prevent situations, but also when a situation happens, what needs to be put in place. When we have an incident, the administration, either the superintendent or the superintendent's designee. So my designee in a case of the high school would be Bob Schultz, our high school principal. We're in charge until the police come on site. Once the police come on site, they take control of the scene, and we take our direction and guidance from them. One of the things that we've politely pushed back on with the police is the police department is the fact that we need to be able to give more information than sometimes they would like. Their contention to us is if you give too much information, we might unknowingly hinder an investigation they're doing. My pushback, and I understand why you're upset, my pushback to them is we've got 4,000 kids, 2,100 families, 20,000 residents that need and crave a little bit more information. So the other day when we met with the police, I think we found a happy medium of being able to release a little bit more information so that, God forbid, anything ever happens again, there will be some better information coming out. The piece about kids and discipline, so I'm never going to be able to share with people what happens to a student. And I'm not suggesting that anyone in this room is looking for that information, but there are people that are. There's also And I understand a little bit of the rumor mill because in absence of information, people create their own narrative. However, there's no way an incident would happen and the students involved on Thursday would be in school on Friday. Like, that's never going to happen. There's always going to be a suspension. So when people reach out and they say, I heard so-and-so's in school, well, I can't say that they're not in school, but what I'm saying now is there is always a suspension when something happens. If offenses warrant it, there's something beyond a suspension. There's a 45-day placement out of the district, there's expulsion, et cetera. I can't ever share any of those details. I too was bothered by the picture of the students at Wawa. We talked about that at length with the police as well, because we were taking some flack for that. The rationale that was shared with us was they took the students to Wawa to get money from an ATM for a tow bill, because the car, we had, when the two people that came in the building, when they were taken by the police, I had the car towed. So they incurred a bill there. So the police took the kids to Wawa. Optics are everything, right? So when you see students that were just taken out of a high school and then you see them at Wawa, and Chief Wheatley understands the optics there, so we talked through that. The other piece that I'll mention is each spring we do tabletop exercises with Upper Dublin Police. So members of our leadership team meet with the police and they run us through several scenarios where we sit around like this and we talk through scenarios. So what happens if there's a situation where you have to shelter in place? What happens if you have an intruder in the building? What is your plan for active shooters, et cetera, et cetera? So I thank those that expressed concern tonight, and I'm always willing and able to talk. So if you ever want to talk, if you want to talk further, please reach out to my office, and we can make that happen. In terms of how we educate kids when there's a large range in a classroom, this sounds like a simple answer, or maybe not even an answer at all. But that is the art of teaching. I think one of the things that our teachers are particularly good at, and they're getting better every day with it, I think as a result of the pandemic, is how do we take a look at the content we're teaching and the standards we're teaching, and how do we make that relevant to different groups of kids inside one class? So that might look like kids producing or showing their knowledge in different ways. It might look like scaffolding notes. It might look like teachers working in small groups. But we will never go back to tracking, and I'm not suggesting that anyone is looking for that or craving that. But even inside tracks, there are still multiple levels of kids. So even in an honors or AP, there's still a wide range of kids. So that's why when we talk about data and we talk about instructional design and we talk about curriculum review, that's why we're talking about all these intricate processes, because it's through all of that that teachers are able to meet the needs of kids inside their classrooms.
All right, thank you. Any other comments? Oh. All right, then that gets us to the end of our meeting. I'd like to announce that our next meeting will be on March 1st, in this same location. And the meeting is adjourned. And happy Groundhog Day tomorrow.